Okay, drum maintenance lesson 2. We're going to talk about care and maintenance of the snare drum. So for me, the big thing with this is common sense. You're going to try and remember not to do the things that are screamingly obvious to not do. But for the sake of teaching, I'm going to show you what they are just now. So the big thing to remember when you're looking after your snare drum is to remember the majority of this drum is metal. Okay, there's metal top rim, metal suspension ring, tension rods, intermediate ring, bottom rim, bottom snare mechanism. The snares themselves, even the harness bracket, is metal. Okay, so a few things to bear in mind when you're dealing with metal. First thing being rust. Alright, so if you're playing out on a parade or a pipe band contest and such, and the drum gets wet, alright, there's not any immediate harm to the metalwork. Okay. If you're to leave the water on the drum, then yeah, there's going to be harm. Alright, because like any bits of metal, if you leave water on it, the water will absorb to the metal and you're going to get rust. Rust on a drum is a nightmare, alright, because it makes everything more difficult. Trying to get a sound out of the drum, trying to fix anything wrong with the drum. If it's rusty, it's a headache. So I always say to folk, once the parade is done, or once the competition is done, if it's been raining, give it a dry down. Alright, dry it down with paper towels or a towel, whatever you want to use to dry it down, and then when you get home, air it out a little bit. Alright, for me, I always say to folk, don't just dry it down, shove it in the case and leave it for a while. Take it out of the case, alright, and leave it sitting out. Obviously it's been dried, leave it sitting out for a while, maybe even an evening. Don't leave it outside, because that's just silly. Leave it out in your room, whatever, for an evening. Let any loose bits of water that you've dried off that you might have missed, no harm in that. And then you can put it away in your drum case and stow it away. Another thing to think about with the metal is hot and cold. So with heat, extreme heat makes metal expand. Cold makes the metal contract a little bit. And I'm not saying if you're to go to Dubai, your drum's going to become a balloon. Alright, that's not going to happen. It's going to expand just that tiny little bit that you don't notice. And the big thing that can happen is, say your drum is set up and ready to go, and you're out in the heat and then you're into the cold. Heat and cold, all these minor extractions and contractions, i.e. getting bigger and smaller, is going to affect the drum. Alright, you might find if you're constantly going from hot to cold, hot to cold, hot to cold, and we need to be quite extreme for this, that your drum might warp a little bit. So an extreme case of warping, imagine you're on your bike and you've seen the video of folk falling off their bike and their back wheels buckled. So it's kind of like that, almost. And I've seen drum rims before that are not as bad as that, but they're just warped a little bit. So they're not flat, they're just that little bit warped. Alright, that for me is going from hot and cold and not taking care of your drum. So the way to get around that, you can't avoid going from hot to cold, but again it's very, very rare that you would do. The best thing to do is when you're storing the drum is ensure that you're not storing it next to a piping hot radiator. You're not leaving it in the car boot overnight. Okay, that's the two extremes that I have seen and I've had to deal with pupils. Mental, I know. Alright, because if you leave it next to a radiator, it's going to expand, you're going to wake up, that top head's going to be burst, that bottom head's going to be burst, and you're going to be due about 60 or 70 quid due to your stupidity. Okay? Same can happen if you leave the drum in a car overnight. Say it's a really, really cold night, the metalwork's going to contract, you've also got condensation to deal with. Alright, so you're going to open your drum and you're going to be like, geez, oh man, it's soaking, but it wasn't raining in my car. It's because you left it in your car overnight, okay? Condensation, hot to cold, drum's soaking, okay? So you've got a lot of work to do to get that drum sounding good again. So we talked about storage, hot and cold. I always try and say to folk when you're storing your drum, always put it back in your case. Alright, make sure before you put it in its case that it's nice and dry. Alright, don't put a wet drum in a case. I mean, you'll maybe have to do a slightly damp drum in a case if you're going home from a parade or a competition. But the minute you get home, get that drum out, give it a really good wipe down, give it a clean, make sure everything's fine on it. alright, and everything's dry. Another thing I always check is the metal work, alright, and I'm not checking for hot and cold here, I'm just checking to make sure there's no cracks in the suspension, the top rim. If there's any cracks, then I would want to get that changed. I'll be checking the top bolts to make sure that they're all intact and they're not cracked. Same with any of the hardware, any of the metalwork, suspension ring especially, because the suspension ring's taking all the tension from the top of the drum, okay, and it's also sustaining the tension from the bottom as well. So it's dealing with a lot of tension, and it's a sturdy bit of kit, the suspension ring. It's really heavy, thick metal, okay, so I'm making sure there's no cracks in that as well. I'm also going to regularly lube the top tension bolts and the bottom tension bolts. So generally I would do that when I'm changing a drum head. Right, so if I'm taking, say this top head's burst, I'm going to take this top rim off. When I go to put the new head on, I'll lubricate each of these bolts, and I'll also put a little bit of lubricant, and it's just Vaseline or petroleum jelly, into the holes in the suspension ring where the tension bolts go. And that's just because metal on metal, alright, tends to, if after a while, not be good unless you maintain it. And regular use of Vaseline is really, really good for that. And it's not much, just a tiny little bit. And it's just lubricating the metal to metal joints, okay? I'm going to move to the bottom. So drum shell, kind of self-explanatory. You're going to check to make sure there's no cracks in that. Your air hole, you're going to make sure it's clear. Wherever it's gone. There it is. You're going to make sure that that's clear. You don't want anything blocking that or covering it up. And then moving on to the bottom skin, you're clearly going to check that that's not burst. Okay, and when you put the drum away, the bottom skin is the most sensitive skin of the two. You've got the top one, which is made of a Kevlar material, so it's really resilient, can sustain a crazy amount of tension over a long period of time. It can deal with being struck by angry drummers. Bottom skin, not so much. Alright, if I was to whack this as hard as I could, I'm probably going to burst it. And I don't want to do that. It can take small taps, and you'll see a lot of drummers, and I do this. Give it a small tap to hear the reaction of the bottom snare. So I'm going to make sure that the bottom skin's not burst, which it isn't. I'm going to check the snares. Now that I've got the drum upside down, I can see inside the drum, and I'll be able to check the snares on the inside of the drum, if any of them are snapped, or if there's any snares on the inside that are maybe doing this, where they're just pulled away from the snare wires. I would be wanting to get them changed or checked. Same again with the metal work. I'm going to check the bottom rim, intermediate ring, tension bolts, and the carrying handles and the bottom snare protector for any damages or any cracks. And then I'll be checking the bottom snare height adjusters and tension adjusters, also for cracks and missing parts. One big one that a lot of folk disregard when they're dealing with putting the drum away and drying the drum is the bottom snare tension adjusters, okay? Because if they get wet or rust gets into them, you find trying to adjust that becomes really, really tricky. And it's a bit embarrassing when you're at a competition, you're trying to tighten something and you're like this, having to do it. It's because you've not looked after the drum, okay? Even when you're doing that tightening a top head that's really tight, it should still, it will give you a bit of resistance, but you shouldn't be like squeaking when you're doing it. That's rust, alright, and poor maintenance skills from yourself if that's the crack. So when you're drying the drum, you'll see, I'm going to zoom in, there's a wee space there. Alright, a lot of folk disregard that space, and little spaces like that on all of the drums. That little space can gather water, and if you don't dry it, that water is going to remain there. It's going to become rust, and then you've got a massive headache on your hands. Alright, try to get rid of that rust. Because I know for a fact, if I was buying a set of drums, if I seen rust on them, I'm going nowhere near it. Alright, because even checking that one drum, it means the rest are going to be like that. Rust City. Not that the drums are useless, but you're going to have a bit of work in your hands to get those drums sounding as good as you want them to do. So a general recap with maintenance. it's such common sense. Okay, a lot of it's common sense. I mean, you would put your drum away, but you would sit it right next to a piping hot radiator. You'd probably think, well, that might not be clever. You're right, it's not clever. I'm going to put this drum away. I'm going to leave it outside in the rain. You wouldn't do that, alright? It's not clever. Okay, so a lot of it's common sense. If you've got a drum case, put it in the drum case and leave it in a room that's got a normal room temperature. It could be a bedroom. You see some folk leave them in the garage. That's not a drama, as long as it's not a garage that's right next to the garage door where all the cold's going to get in. Alright, I've left drums in the garage before and they're fine. Okay, as long as they're in a case. The case will give it a bit of warmth, believe it or not. Always remember hot and cold. What the hot does to the metalwork, what the cold does to the metalwork. Always dry your drum. And I would say, as a little bit of advice, before you go to a competition or a parade, check your drum before you go. Because the amount of folk I've seen that turn up to, say, a gala or a competition with their drum and it's burst. You know, and you're like, well, that's not just happened now, that could have burst last night or the day before. If you check it in the morning and let your leading drummer or drum teacher, whoever know, or if you are the man, you can fix it, let them know, alright, because they'll have either a spare drum that you can use or they can change the head of that drum before you play it. If you turn up with a broken drum head, say the top head's burst or the bottom head's burst, you're not going to be able to play at the parade. Alright, it might be something you're really excited to do, you're not going to be playing. Alright, and it's just because you didn't take 2 minutes out of your day to get your drum out and check it. Okay, so all of these points we spoke about today, hugely important for maintaining your drum, making sure you look after your drum, because certainly at the Preston Lodge Pipe Band the kids get given a drum, and when you're looking after that drum you're responsible for it, because drums these days can retail from anywhere to 400 to, I've seen drums for £1,000 per drum, may I add. Alright, so you've got to really look after them. And again, it's all common sense. We're not in the habit of throwing bills at folk for fixing parts. Alright, we tend to hammer home the cost and the importance of looking after drums, as should any pipe band. So I hope you've enjoyed that. Any questions? Again, just give me a shout. Happy to help out anyone or give any further maintenance lessons if required.